Valentina, quais são os outros recados antes de passarmos para o Anders aqui?
Isso, então, boa tarde para todo mundo. É mais uma vez uma felicidade estar aqui com o professor Anders para dividir um pouco desse conhecimento que ele tem. O que eu queria dizer para vocês.
Os outros recados antes de passarmos para o Anders?
Só um momento aqui. Isso, então, eu só quero dizer para vocês que ele vai usar uma página, um artigo em PDF que ele deixou, inclusive, de presente para a Braf, e vocês vão poder baixar esse artigo para quem quiser, ele ainda está em inglês, né? Mas para quem quiser, vocês podem baixar, o link vai estar disponível aí no chat do YouTube também. Então, para quem quiser acompanhar o que o professor for falar, eu vou, em alguns momentos, compartilhar a tela desse documento, mas quem quiser baixar, pode baixar também para poder acompanhar o que o professor vai falar. Então é isso, mais um dia hoje, estamos muito felizes de estar por aqui, não sei, eu volto então agora para o Toninho.
Valentina,
diga.
Além disso, sobre as perguntas, ontem nós tivemos perguntas muito interessantes, né? E a gente não conseguiu contemplar todas, mas eu peço que as pessoas que tiverem perguntas, para não deixar para postar as perguntas no final, que elas postem à medida que as perguntas surjam, né? Enquanto o professor Anderson está falando, surgiu uma pergunta, já posta lá para a gente, que a gente vai cortar e colar aqui, botar no Zoom, para depois o professor Anderson responder. Ele vai responder as perguntas não somente no final, mas durante a palestra.
Isso, porque a palestra ela é dividida em alguns tópicos, então no final de cada tópico a gente vai coletar as perguntas que vocês foram deixando e passa para o professor poder responder para todo mundo. Eu acho que assim fica mais fácil, né? Vamos ver se a gente consegue dar conta hoje das perguntas. Então, vamos começar. Muito obrigada, Anders, pela sua presença. Vamos começar nosso segundo dia.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to take part in your festival yesterday, and today we have a long program in front of us. The main title for my lectures or seminars are Tradition and Freedom, and today we are going to look more at freedom. Yesterday it was much about that tradition, mainly different French flute traditions. And now today I will speak and tell you about my research that to quite some degree deals with the concept of freedom. I think we can do like this, that when I need you to see a figure, something like that, so everybody knows, I will just ask Valentina to show it to you, and then that will come up on the screen. And then just before we start as well, regarding the questions, I think it's a wonderful idea that we take the questions as long as we work together today. I suppose someone would read the questions for me, so I don't have to go into my computer. That would be very practical. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, let's repeat where we started yesterday. And that was, I did use a quote by Otteter. And the quote, basically, the meaning is that it is possible, according to Otteter, and I must confess in my own opinion as well, that we can transfer knowledge and even skills in such a complicated thing as playing the flute also through text. And right now you can see on your screen here the three quotes that I mentioned yesterday as well. And I think we are somewhere now between the second and the third step. But I just repeat from yesterday, the first quote by Kant is, be courageous. If we are a student, if we are a beginner, if we are professional, if we are virtuoso, be courageous. We should use our own mind. That is my experience when I have been privileged to have lots of contact with outstanding musicians. Of course, they were well anchored in traditions, but they also used their own mind. They were not too dependent. That was very interesting. And part of my studies was with the string quartet, the very famous Amadeus Quartet. And it was amazing to learn from them to be independent of models. I can give you a little example of that. And that was simply so that, of course, I wanted to play the Mozart flute quartets during my study cycle with Amadeus Quartet. And I had very, very nice colleagues to play, or classmates to play together with the strings. And I did choose the D major quartet by Mozart as the first piece, because it's a little bit like almost a mini concerto. And I felt safe with that. And it worked very well. And then Mr. Breinin, the first violinist in the ensemble, he said to me, "Yes, young man, you're playing really nicely, beautiful, but I must ask you a question. Why do you make so many dynamics?" And I was confused by the question. So I said, yes, that's how we used to do. And he said, yes, I understand. But why do you make them? And I couldn't come up with a really good answer, I must confess. So I said, yes, Jean-Pierre Rampal makes them. And then he continued to dig into the question and said, and you think that's the reason why you must do it? And I said, so I don't know what to say now. If I may ask you a question, Mr. Breinin, what do you think I should do? And then he said, of course you're right. You must make dynamics. You must make many things when you play, of course. But he said to me that if you just make the dynamics because someone else are making the dynamics, is not much to come with. And his answer, playing the first movement, is that we would play lots of mezzo forte, sometimes more powerful, sometimes less. But he reminded me of a thing. He said, if you think about a finale in a Mozart opera, then you have Don Giovanni, Donna Anya, Leporello, they're all on stage. And they all sing with quite strong voices, but each of them had different character. So you can not only work with dynamics, you must work with character as well. And I thought that was a very good thing to say, and it did help me a lot. Another situation was that I was very lucky to play together with an incredibly good pianist. I was a young professional flutist, 23, 24 years old, and worked in Germany. And we should play a recital. He was a Czech piano virtuoso that worked a lot in the old Soviet Union. He was a star in Soviet Union, playing Tchaikovsky concertos all the time, and Rachmaninoff with the best orchestras. And he offered to play together with me, and I wanted to play the Gabriel Pierné Sonata. I'm sure many of you know the piece. It's a little bit Rachmaninoff-like music, but in French style. And then he said to me, after we had a rehearsal or two, he said, yes, you're really playing the piece very well. But when I listen to you, when you play it, it seems like that it's someone else playing than you. And then he said, I was a bit kind of confused. And then he said, do you have studied a recording very much or someone? And I said, I must confess, one of my absolute favorite recordings with this piece is the recording made by Jean-Pierre Rampal, and I have obviously listened often to it. As he said, of course, that's fine, you're a young man, but take it as a good lesson. Of course you can be inspired, but follow the footsteps of the master that you really like, but you must be your own master. Okay. I think we can go straight to the topic, and that is defamiliarization and freshness. And that is taken from a Japanese designer, Kenya Hara. It's a book that I strongly recommend to all of you, called White, that was published a couple of years ago. I also have taken as a motto for the section of defamiliarization and freshness, I have taken a quote that comes from the swordsmanship word in the Middle Age. And the saying is, completely forget about the mind and you will do all things well. So that is a kind of an anti-intellectualization suggestion. And we will dig into that. So having decided to study and learn an art with a high amount of complexity, like flute playing, in many respects it is a complicated craft. Of course, we need years and years and years to practice and to fulfill the criteria of mastery. This daily practice based on, generally spoken, the same patterns such as scales, intervals, son filet for the beginner as for the virtuoso player. For the student, in a sense, is a work to acquire new territory, depending a little bit where we are. For the professional, it is to safeguard the territory, to keep it alive and operative. We can't say that I could do it 10 years ago. We must always be able to do it right now. And to look at the facts like that, basically the virtuoso practice the same things as the becoming player. And I think it was extremely inspiring when I read an article, an interview with Sir James Galway, when he claimed, and I believe him, that he has practiced the Tafel scales an hour a day throughout his career. I think that's incredible. And at the same time, very understandable. Of course, it makes sense. If we continue, I have a quote from Kenya Hara about the idea about freshness. When I meditate on an object, it becomes refreshingly different as if I had just encountered it for the first time. Even during the process of writing, I can discover something unusual in the characters I have used so many times before. In moments of this, we must feel some of the freshness that foreigners experience when they encounter Japanese characters for the first time. And we were talking about Japanese characters as this complicated writing with kanji signs and so. So we see something for the first time. As I said yesterday, something, the beginner's mind. We start with something completely new. To put it in a flutistic context where we maybe practice on twinkle, or we practice the famous Tafel scales, I will continue to quote Kenya Hara. He says, exactly as I said yesterday, going back to the source of our acquired knowledge allows us to perceive things in a new light. I wonder if whether the original meaning of to understand refers to this situation. In relation to practicing the flute over decades, generally with the same scales and exercises, I think that can be rather inspired by another thought by Kenya Hara dealing with the idea or the concept of beauty. I will read the quote for you. It is easy to think that beauty resides in the realm of creative activity. Yet beauty hardly appears from nowhere. Recently, I've come to believe that we discover it through the cleaning and polishing we do preserve things as they are. Refined beauty cannot be produced by short-term effort. It can only be established through a long process of cleaning and polishing that enables a human being and his natural surroundings to coexist as one body. Yeah, if we think about practicing the scales, that is to polish over and over and over the same thing over years. When we are talking about this concept of defamiliarize something and the arts and the idea of rediscovery or discovery, also the concept of rediscovery, for the performer, this relates to the very moment of the explosive, improvised, and unforeseeable moment during the act of performance. And that is exactly what great virtuoso players like Jean-Pierre Rampal, and of course many, many more, insisted on, that while performing, let's say, a concerto by Mozart, the audience should get the impression that the piece is created in the very moment of performance, and that the player should encounter the piece while performing as if it was the very first time it was played, as in a kind of discovery. Here I would like to make a personal reflection. I was lucky to have the best flutist in the Nordic countries when I was a young man, studying at the Academy of Music in Gothenburg. He's now an old man, 90 years old. He was by far the best flutist in the Nordic countries. He was not Swedish, he came from Switzerland and was a star student of the Paris Conservatoire and studied, was a classmate of Michel de Bost, for example, and Alexander Marais. I admired my teacher immensely. And he had a special contract with the Gothenburg Symphony, the National Swedish Orchestra, and it was very privileged. He had the possibility to perform 2 solo concertos each year with the orchestra and the best conductors. We've made many people very jealous on him. And I went to all symphony concerts every week. I went to the symphony concerts and listened to the orchestra, and he was all the time playing principal flute, and I listened to his solo concertos. I had some trouble when I listened to his solo concertos. He played everything by heart, even the Petrassi concerto he played by heart. And it was, of course, absolutely perfect, stainless steel. But I must confess that I had some trouble with myself, because I was always much more impressed when he played in the orchestra than being a soloist. And that troubled me. And I thought quite a lot about how could that come to be. Years later, I think I understood. Because when he played in the orchestra, he was a very, very good flutist. Of course, he didn't practice these things. He just made them like that. That was not a big deal for him. But when he made his concertos, he is a very intelligent musician. He always had the most intelligent and superb solutions on how to make an interpretation. Years later, I understood that one of the reasons it might have been why I felt a bit strange about it is that the moment of performance was the moment of reproducing exactly what was practiced and thought through. When practicing patterns like scales, articulations, etc., and at the same time aiming for a kind of discovery, I have myself inspired by Japanese Noh theater from the Japanese Middle Age, because there is a concept of freshness in this. And I have a quote from that. And that is like this: the flower embodies the same idea as charm and freshness. What flower blooms forever? It is precisely because blossoms scatter that the reason comes around them to bloom again. Hence the feeling of freshness. In the Noh, it is vital to realize that the flower blooms when stagnation is avoided. Freshness is achieved by changing styles and not being limited to just one mode of artistic expression. And I think that connects very well to the headline for these seminars that we make together now. Tradition, in a sense, is a way how people have used to do things and have discovered a plenitude of solutions and possibilities. Then these must be used with freedom. If we come to then how to acquire the skills, being able to perform, and that I'm not by far not only thinking about performance as being the peak experience for someone being principal flute in one of the top orchestras. As a matter of fact, we were talking about Suzuki teaching yesterday. Of course, an 8-year-old child can also perform in the most stunning way. And I will give you, before we go into then my research, I will give you an example. I was invited to Suzuki summer camp in Finland some years ago. And there was a boy, I think he was about 10 years old, maximum, 9 or 10. And he absolutely wanted to play Orfeo, the D minor solo. And I asked my colleague, do you think it's a bit difficult piece? After all, not technically necessarily, but emotionally. But the boy absolutely wanted to play it, so of course. And then we had a lesson. His mother was there. I was there. We had a pianist, and his little brother, that was only 3-4 years old, was also there. And we worked a bit on the piece. Then I said, please play the piece from the beginning to the end. And it was only the D minor section. And that was a just fantastic experience of musical performance. He played the piece together with the pianist. After that, he was finished. We were completely stunned. We didn't say anything for half a minute, and that's a long time of quietness. I could see his mother got tears in her eye. I did so too, and the boy did so too, and the pianist. Intuitively, he had grasped this very sad story that Orpheus looks back to see his beloved Evridike, and she disappears because of that. Then we talked a little bit about it, and the pianist said, can you say something about the piece? And I said, yes, I can say something about the piece from where it belongs, but I don't tell him why all this happens. He must find out of that when he becomes a young man. I don't want to talk with him about that. But his emotion was there. That was a stunning moment. All right, I wrote a book which I call Le respect de la tradition, in respect of tradition. And that is part of my PhD that I made to finish 2008. And that PhD discusses aspects of French flute traditions over a period of about 300 years, also from Otteter up until today. Important findings were based on interviews with flutist Alain Marion and Peter Lloyd. We talked a lot about them yesterday, discussing aspects of teaching methods, aesthetics, flute playing, etc. Special attention was given to flutistic aesthetics, etc., relating to what sometimes in France is called l'École de Marseille. And the l'École de Marseille is something relating to Alain Marion, Rampal, both Rampals and other players, Maxence Larieux, of course, too. My research focused on topics related to music education of the professional musician and mainly on flute players on professional level. A tool, a scientific tool, methodologically, were material based on hermeneutics, as the old tradition of interpretation since the antiquity, whereby German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer was very important. Important aspects of the framework for the professional flautistic training are topics such as intuition, imitation, mimesis, and maieutics. Maieutics, I guess you basically know what that is, but maieutics is the famous method used by Socrates. The idea is the person you talk with already know, but they don't know that they know. So you reveal their knowledge with clever questioning. That is a thing that I really worked with. Further, I did look at flautistic learning connected to perspectives, including concepts such as the du naturel dans l'art, le son naturel, le bon goût, typical French concepts. And other perspectives linked to Rameau and Altesse, Proust, Heidegger, when they were dealing and are dealing with these kind of questions. This research was then dealing with questions related how to the above-mentioned concepts have been articulated within the personal practice of the development of craftsmanship and musicianship, as well as in teaching situations. How these areas and concepts have been described takes on a mirroring role as investigations, experiences, propositions, answers to research questions. In relation to these topics, this research aims to contribute with practical perspectives and guidelines for the practice of flautistic techniques and interpretation. An important focus were methods for group teaching as well as for individual lessons. To answer questions related to all these flautistic activities, the research process had the form of two empirical studies. One study, study A, was dealing with an analysis of flute method books and everything connected to artifacts that we could historically also study. And then there was a second study, I called it study B, and the study B was then based on two very long interviews, one with Alain Marion and one with Peter Lloyd. Both took 3 days. Each of them took 3 days. And they were based on my contact and friendship with these two people for a long time before. So I was very well prepared for these interviews. Both friends, Marion and Lloyd, were very motivated. Marion told me, I'm very happy to do this work with you because I want to leave some tracks behind me apart from the recordings. And Peter Lloyd was exactly the same. And an interesting thing that I maybe mentioned yesterday, but I can say it again, is that I remember once I went visiting him in the summer and I called him every day back saying that thank you very much, we spent a whole day together. And I said, when I was leaving, driving home to our house in close to Marseille, I said, Alain, you have a system. We must study. You have really a systematized work. And he laughed and said, no, you are too clever. It's not like that. Then the funny thing is he didn't answer on the phone because he probably did something else. Then the next morning, very early, he called and he told me, I couldn't sleep the whole night, Anders, because of what you told me. Because you're right. There is a system, we must work. And this interview during 3 days was a result of that kind of work. And it was the same with Peter Lloyd. So the art of French flute playing, flute educational literature, flutes and flautists, that is study A. And I think I will talk a little bit about study A and B, and then maybe we can take in some questions. So the study A described and analyzed the art of flute playing as described through artifacts, recordings, texts, also the flutes, of course, within what we can say French flute traditions. A general finding regarding method for learning was that it basically and generally all the time had a stepwise character. This is not very surprising, but research is one thing and what common sense is something else. We must prove and put it into a system. This stepwise learning has similarities with one of the important pedagogues of the 17th century, Comenius, with Pestalozzi, later Swedish Larsson, and Gellrich in Germany. It's a bit later. And they all describe the learning as a process of small steps. And each step will be called something. We give the different things names. A kind of an umbrella name would then, for example, be, now we work on articulation, and then we can break down the phenomenon and the activity of articulation in many layers. And in this light, the French flute methods show characteristics as applications of this kind of, from the antiquity method and thoughts regarding learning with roots really back to the antiquity. Another general observation was that the flute method generally have a rather extensive section of duets for two flutes. A conclusion is that the French flute traditions has used and understood duet playing between teacher and student as having positive effects on learning and the assimilation within the tradition. By playing duets, the teacher gets a role as a model for flutistic craftsmanship, for how to play together in time, work with phrasing and elicit emotions. The most important aspect of duet playing is probably that this activity resembles a dialogue and opens for learning whereby imitation and dialogue are understood as strong mediating tools. Generally spoken, the musical expression in these duets has an elegant and classicistic character and represents an aesthetics that basically is understood as suitable for the flutes, but outrules a more dramatic expression that comes later. Regarding the findings and analysis of the interviews, both interviews was, as I just said, very long, 3 days. And the interviews discuss questions about teaching methods, aesthetics, of flute playing mechanisms related to how to practice and how to develop flute technique and interpretation within the French flute traditions. Parts of these interviews represent indeed genuine values in that they are historical documents comprising never before collected research material concerning the flutes, its 20th century history and its teaching, with a focus on the French flute traditions. Special attention was, again, when it comes to Alain Marion, what we call l'École de Marseille. Now, in France, sometimes this is an issue that is somewhat questioned. It depends a little bit who you ask. Some people say, yes, of course, it's great. Some other people can say, it didn't never exist. That is something else. Lloyd and Marion explained practical concepts regarding flute playing, performance teaching, and learning in depth. And that definitely contributes to our knowledge about the 20th century flute history. Both Lloyd and Marion share the opinion that a stepwise development towards complexity of craftsmanship in the most natural way will be the stepwise procedure. However, they use two different methods. Alain Marion, he used, and I know that many of you have heard him live when he has been teaching and you have studied with him, he used his flute all the time. He told me once he can't teach if he doesn't have a flute in his hands. He wanted to model things. I made it very, very well, I must say. It was always impressive to hear his playing. Whereas Peter Lloyd refused the idea of using his flute when he was teaching, because he was thinking that what needed to be done was a kind of an understanding. And he used the spoken word, and he was very good at it, to use it in the situations to explain what he wanted, because he wanted the student to understand. And of course, both Marion and Lloyd were aiming for the same thing. And I think that is interesting that they made it in so superficially looked at differently. And they both used, without really knowing that they used, the idea of the dialogue. Marion, he used his flute and dialogue with the student through that, and Lloyd with the spoken word. But the interesting thing is also both agreed fully and completely on what we were aiming at. An interesting aspect of this is that Marion obviously was born into what we can say a kind of French flute tradition, whereas Peter Lloyd came from England and wanted to learn about this tradition. He wanted to be part of this tradition, which in a sense maybe also could explain why Marion had a more intuitive approach using his playing. We were, so to speak, in the same swimming pool and we just go for it, whereas Lloyd had to reach that swimming pool, to go into the same water. And there were a kind of more intellectualization involved. Should we stop there maybe to put in a question, if you think that makes sense, or we can continue?
Yes, Anders. We don't have questions, but we have some comments that we'd like to share with you.
Yes.
Toninho, could you share these comments with Anders, or would you prefer that I do that?
Sim, posso ler aqui. A Yanes Coelho disse: está maravilhoso isso aqui. O Sebastião Interlandi, né? Está bem interessante a relação, a interpretação musical com os pensadores filósofos, Anders. E o Raul colocou polos de oposição, muito legal, interessantes ambos modelos.
Okay, should I continue? So I can say that a result and a finding of
Sim, eu acho que sim,
this...
né, Valentina? Continuamos.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so a finding is that I did attempt to construct a new concept. If we talk about maieutics, also the Socratic method, the asking person, the teacher, the teachers of the teacher, Socrates himself, he had the idea that the partner that he was talking with or teaching already knew the truth, already knew. And through a clever questioning could dig it out and make it clear for the person in question. And if we think about a flute duet, if we play, and I'm sure many of us or you have experienced the same thing, you play together with a really, really good flutist, and especially when you're a student, you play together and it feels so easy. I can give you an example of that. I talked about Amadeus Quartet and my studies with them in Germany. I already knew what would become my wife, Magali, and she's very interested in music and wanted to listen on the classes with Amadeus Quartet because it was so fascinating. And she said, and sometimes Mr. Breinin or some of the other members said, Breinin maybe said to the violinist in my ensemble, now I want to play. Or the cellist could say, now I want to play. And my wife said, wow, if you always would play like you played when Mr. Breinin was playing the violin, I don't know what can happen. And I think that is a good example, and we have many of us have experienced that. It feels so easy and it just comes by itself. So in a way, then Breinin, in my case, was like acting like Socrates. He knew that there was, after all, something in my playing, and then with his playing, he could dig it out. He could show me. So I did try to construct a concept about this, and I call it automaieutics. So that you have to be teaching yourself, because that was also something that was very clear when analyzing the results from the artifacts in study A, as well as from the interviews in study B, that it was more clear-cut, obviously, in the interviews, that the idea of that you must be able to teach yourself came up here and then. But if you were on the track of that idea, you could also, when studying the artifacts, find similar statements throughout the history of French flute playing. And in the material that you could download now, the second last appendix is a page in the English translation of the Altesse method, dealing with the perfection in execution and performance. And the final paragraph is that there is, even the best teacher can't teach you the essential things that you have to find out of yourself. And I often think about that when it comes to orchestra playing. When we are lucky enough to win auditions, we finally sit there on a chair and we are in the orchestra and we are allowed to do that. I remember my first couple of years being a principal flute in a German orchestra, that it was like euphoric period, because you learn so much about music. Of course, your colleagues doesn't tell you very much. They expect you to being able to play. That's why you're there. But suddenly your teachers were Beethoven, Mozart, Richard Wagner, or Stravinsky. And as I used to tell my students, do whatever you want with the idea of playing in orchestra. So, but try to be able to play there for a couple of years, because you will learn something that you can't learn in another way. And that is also very much of an automaietic procedure. Another interesting finding was that while comparing study A as artifacts with the interviews in study B, they were basically confirming each other in both directions. The interview material confirmed the artifacts and vice versa, which points on a kind of a quite, we can say, compact idea of aesthetics and traditions. If we can go now to, let's see, that is page 36. I think that's page 36. I think we need to take a look at that. and there we are. Yes, this model is an attempt to describe a process of practicing and performance. And we will return to this and go some steps further. And I call that as a model for automaeutics. And if we look at this model, we can see in the center, we have this circle where we have some factors like intuition, flow of the instant, spontaneity, emotion, emotional memory, the Madeleine cake. And yesterday we talked a little bit about the Madeleine cake, the French muffins described by Marcel Proust when describing how the involuntary memory could work. Then we have on the top a box which I call performance intuitive process. Down right, reflection on practice, and down left, planning of practice. And if we look at the planning of practice and reflection on practice, we can see that I call it discursive processes. And discursive in this sense means a stepwise procedure. And if you look at the planning of practice down left, it's an automaeutic phase where we work with ourselves. We make a kind of rational planning, mainly not automatized motor patterns like different fingerings, whatever it might be, and we mobilize the intellectual memory. Down right, we have reflection on practice. That is what we have done after practicing. Also automaeutics, we teach ourselves rational reflection after thought, we could say. Also mainly not automatized motor patterns and intellectual memory as well. So that in a sense describes roughly how we can work with automaeutics while planning our practice, analyzing our practice, and proceed. But at the same time, you can see the center with intuition, flow of the instant, etc. So flow of the instant is what popularly is called flow. We all know it. And there is, so to speak, an interaction between these things. What we are doing as musicians is, of course, we are aiming for a kind of performance. And a finding then in my work with my dissertation and all the research that we have been talking about now comes to the conclusion that the moment of performance is an intuitive process. It is an automaeutic umbrella over the whole thing, but planning and reflection of the instant. It's mainly automatized motor patterns. Now we know the fingerings. It's emotional memory. When I teach, I often ask a student that I don't know if they have a driving license. And then they laugh a little. Why do you want to know that? Yes, I want to know if you have a driving license, because driving a car is an extremely good example of where we do things intuitively and without too much reflection. We simply act on what happens around us. And I said, if you're good, normal good driver, if you see something coming up in front of you, it could be a dog, it could be an old man or old lady, a child just running out, you don't think what I'm going to do now, you simply just do something. You just try to stop the car, you try to avoid it going to the left or to the right, you do something. Because if you would start to think, oh, here's a kid running out of the street, if I'm not careful, oh my God, I will drive over the kid. No, it's too late. You must simply react. There is the same kind of idea, as you have understood now. I'm interested in Japanese martial arts and especially swordsmanship. There is an example of that same thing. If you imagine a bridge, and it comes a swordsman from each side, and they meet in the middle of the bridge, and there will be a fight. At the same moment, that will be a snowstorm or sandstorm. You can't really see. The question is then, who survives? And the answer is the one that lets the sword cut by itself. Because you have to go on intuition. which is not so easy all the time. Okay, let's proceed. Planning and structure of daily practice. Obviously, there are loads of things relating to that. And of course, we have to do something to structure the practice because there are so many parameters. And we can say that if we look at the méthode complète de flûte by Defamiliarization and Goubert, they basically give in their advice for daily practice 3 blocks of work. One is scales, the other is intervals, arpeggios, trills, and long notes, and the third is studies and repertoire. And if we just look at page 37, you can see what this study plan looks like. And in the appendix, in the material that you could download, you have the French version, but this is also from the original 1958 edition of Defamiliarization and Goubert. When I asked him about scheduling the daily practice, and more in detail, he recommended to practice in short sections of just 5 minutes, something like that. You can see that at the bottom of this page. And there I just gave some examples of what to do. For example, you start with warming up, playing tunes or scale patterns in a comfortable register. Secondly, sustained notes. Thirdly, intervals. Third, fourth, etc., as you can see on the screen. And you make very short breaks. So you play for 5 minutes. You don't have time to drink a cup of coffee after that, these 5 minutes, but you make a micro pause and then you carry on like this. And the research on learning has proven that this is, as a matter of fact, a good way to work and to isolate different things. Then on the next page, if we can see that, please, Valentina, the next page, I have tried to make an explanation regarding understanding and imitation and modeling. So if you look at the very bottom here, we have the presentation of the technique and its implementation. Here we can say that we introduce a new technique, maybe triple tonguing, whatever you want. Then the task of the teacher, this is new material for the learning person, has to be crystal clear. This can of course be shown while playing and explaining what I do with my tongue, for example, tukutu or something like that. It can also be explained with words, as Peter Lloyd used to do. And I think there is an interaction of both possibilities there. And the teacher's task is to be excessively clear in the explanations and the modeling. In the second step, as a process of understanding, developing an understanding of the technique, is implementation and practice. This is a task for the student now to develop a personalized understanding of the technique in question and how it can be implemented and practiced. And this is typically a process of interaction between the teacher and the student, aiming for developing clear conceptual ideas. The third step, process of practicing. A stepwise reduction of analytical understanding towards that the technique and its implementation gets internalized and automatized. That is the beginning of practicing. And as you can see, the arrows, they go up and down now between the process of understanding, the presentation. They all interact now, these 3 blocks. And then the second stage of the process of practicing is, initially, is the practicing process based on understanding and analytical method, being a stepwise procedure aiming for spontaneous non-intellectualization and implementation of the technique. Obviously, there are elements of intellectualization in the first and the second box, but now we are working hard to go away from the intellectualization. We could go back to the idea of driving a car. How do I do to change gear? I have to press down one pedal, I have to do something here, and then I continue. But little by little we learn to do that just without thinking. And then we come to the fourth box, the top box, and that is a kind of intuitive performance. It starts with that the interpretation of the technique is now spontaneous and an intuitive tool for musical expression. And the finalization, the implementation of the technique is now internalized and automatized, like driving the car. The process of understanding and intellectualization is not necessary anymore. I think that shows very, very well a possible path on learning that I guess many of us, more or less, we can be intuitive the whole way through, but I think we have passed through these kind of steps. And now, of course, in that model, what I call teacher could, of course, obviously be replaced by the player, and the player teaching him or herself. That's the same thing then. Regarding the final level, the intuitive performance, I have a quote. We can look at that on page 39. That's the next page. At the bottom there, we have it. And that is also dealing with swordsmanship in Japan and Noh theater. And that's from the 17th century. And the quote is like this: when you dance, the hands hold the fan and the foot takes the step. When you do not forget everything, when you go on thinking about performing with the hands and the feet well and dancing accurately, you cannot be said to be skillful. When the mind stops in the hand and feet, none of your acts will be singular. If you do not completely discard the mind, everything you do will be done poorly, in a sense. Of course, I would never dare or even like to criticize my teacher that I told you about before. That was so important for my development when I was a young man, 17, 18 years old. But I think it touches what I intuitively could perceive as a young man, that my teacher was in the mood, because he was so clever and he was so strong as a flutist, that he knew that he was so good and that he could find so intelligent interpretations. And I think he did not, by a reason or another, let go completely. And I can understand that very well, because when you play at home, now everything is strange with the pandemic, but when you play at home, and I often played, for example, the St. Matthew Passion here, I must confess that it's not so easy to play the big solos when you are at home, whereas when you are on travel, making tours, it feels a little bit easier. And I think he felt that when he had the chance to perform twice a year as a big soloist with the best conductor, the big concertos, many people were angry and jealous, and he wanted to be super perfect to mute criticism. Now, should we continue, or should we have some questions coming in so far?
We have some questions, a lot of questions actually. If we could stop a little bit for these questions, that would be nice. Because they were still talking about the other topic, but we can come back a little. So, okay. You read, Toninho? Yes?
Sim, Valentina, vou ler. Primeiro nós voltamos, essa é do tópico anterior, né? Mas eu acho que se aplica bem aqui também, é do Anders, né? Que ele fala sobre a questão de como ele pensa na possibilidade de integração, de tocar junto com o aluno enquanto ensinar, né? E também de usar a palavra, né? Para ensinar. Então, assim, ele quer que o Anders comente sobre essas duas questões, de ensinar tocando ou tocar junto, e também através de instruções verbais. E se é possível integrar as duas coisas.
Okay, I will try to answer. I think in these terms that in a sense we can't plan a lesson as we can't plan a recital or a performance. So even though you give your student a task to fulfill for next week, whatever it might be, you don't know what happened since last week. So you must be very open all the time to, so to speak, to being able to improvise. I firmly support the idea that you can't really plan your teaching. Of course you can plan. We work on Cassandra's Dream Song, we work on the Vienne Concerto or something, obviously, yes, of course. But then it ends. I have an example on that. The first time I met Peter Lloyd, I was invited to do something in England. And I went listen to his technique classes, because that did interest me, because I was honestly never interested studying in England myself. So I was then interested in see how did he, a very good English flute player, do this. So I just asked Peter Lloyd, what are you going to do today? I said, I don't know. And I laughed a little bit and said, okay, but honestly, you don't know. Okay, I know that we will work on scales, but I can't say more because I really don't know what happens in the other end. So we have to see. I think that is a good point of departure. Then, of course, trying to answering your question, I have no problem that we intellectualize things. And I have no problem with that we demonstrate things in the intuitive way. I think one must follow, when I did discuss this with Alain Marion, he said, you have to teach each student cas par cas. So each student is an individual. In 1 second, the best thing to do is to explain with words. Half a minute later, it makes no sense to explain with words. You better take up your flute and play. So I think the answer is, or could be, that the teacher should use both methods. I'm a little bit skeptical of using just one or the other. I think my experiences, since have had the privilege to work with extremely talented young people, as becoming professional flutists in several academies of music all around the world, is that you must be very careful. Everybody needs intellectualization. Everybody needs being intuitive. And I think I did discuss this very much with Alain Marion. And he told me once that he thought himself that he was a bit too emotional and intuitively. So he told me that he wanted to be a bit more intellectual. And he gave a good example of saying that you don't necessarily have to be 50% intellectualization, 50% intuitive. Maybe the balance is 70% intellect, 30% intuition. And a minute later, it swaps and it's the other way around. So that is, of course, a skill for the teacher to be fast in reaction. And coming back to the idea of dialogue, the Socratic method. Of course, Socrates can't have had a checklist when he did his questioning, but he had a feeling for where to go, and little by little he could reveal the truth. I don't know if that is enough answer for you, but I would strongly suggest use both techniques, be sensitive for what happens in front of you, and I'm sure that would work very nicely.
Anders, temos uma próxima pergunta, que é da Sarah Kelly.
Yes.
Ela fala, é uma pergunta sobre memorizar, tocar de memória, né? Ela pergunta, que tipo de exercícios ou práticas você recomenda para memorizar uma obra musical?
Yes, that is really an issue. And of course, to some extent, it depends, I think, on, first of all, how used you are to memorize things, also, in our case, flute pieces. Secondly, when you did start to do these kind of things. Thirdly, my experience shows me that some students are incredibly, they have a memory like stainless steel. I can ask them for fun, can you imagine to play Cassandra Streamsong by heart in, let's say, 1 month's time? And some say, yes. Okay, then we go for that. And miracle, 1 month later, they play Cassandra Streamsong by heart. It's just amazing. I can remember I had one student, and she played the John Williams concerto. I think there are several, but one of these John Williams concertos, which are tricky because this does not sound like Jaws or Star Wars. It's a kind of dodecaphonie style. Very tricky to memorize. And I remember we have every year auditions to be soloist with the Academy Orchestra. And the student played the John Williams concerto. I suggested her to do it. She did so. And the last lesson before the summer, I said, and okay, you will be the soloist in beginning of October. So I want you to play it by memory when we meet up first week in September. To push her to practice simply, because after all, it was a very famous conductor and stuff. And she said, yes, of course. When we were there first week of September, perfect. The conductor was incredibly impressed. The same student I did send down to Nice for the summer academy in Nice. And I said to her, now you will find many good flutists. We will find the star students of the Paris Conservatoire and many other places. You will find many good players. Not so easy to make a good, to have success. So I said, there is a trick. Play something that most people don't do by heart. And she asked, what to do? I said, you play the Berio Sequenza by heart smack, and you will see. If you can do that, something will happen. If you play Mozart concerto, too many people can do that. But if you play the Berio Sequenza, that will impress. What happened? She played perfectly by heart. Her flute playing was good, but not extraordinarily good. But her success was as if she would have been an extraordinary flutist, because they were simply so incredibly impressed that you could play it by heart. Even in Paris, I don't play it by heart very often. These are some examples around it. Also, another aspect of the by heart playing is that some players are really playing better when they play by heart, and others plays better with score. My suggestion when it comes, for example, to orchestral excerpts, what we have to work a lot with, is that my students must play all orchestral excerpts by heart. And they should come with 3 orchestral excerpts regularly every week, 3 new excerpts. And that is how it should be done. Then when we have the yearly examinations, we have one in December and one in June. Then they have to play, free choice from there. We have made quite many orchestral excerpts, free choice, and they must be played by heart in front of the jury. Then my colleagues, the oboes, the clarinets, the bassoons, they always say, Anders, why do you always force your students to learn every orchestral excerpt by heart? I said, that's because of you, my dear colleagues, because you are ruthless when it comes to auditions. The slightest little mini mistake and you are out. So therefore, I want to make my students so strong so that they can play under pressure, these things. Then, if you would do that in an audition behind the screen, that's not my business. You do whatever you want. Do what you prefer. But in this situation, I want you to do it. So this is the way to use by memory playing, simply, as I used to say, the better the memory playing is, when you have not a very well developed memory, because then you must practice more. I also can remember that some of my students went to a Juilliard school many, many years ago. Julius Baker was a teacher, and they also played everything by heart. And someone asked in that master class, my student told me, someone asked and said, Mr. Baker, you want all your students to play everything by heart, but allow us to say we haven't seen you play by heart very often. Why do you insist? And I think he came up with a very good answer, simple but good. I will want them to practice more, because if they should memorize, they must practice more, and that's a good thing. Then trying to answer the question how to memorize a piece. I would myself, and what I do is that I practice everything that I play, I practice by memory. But I must confess, I don't play so often by heart, and especially not complicated works like Cassandra's Dream Song. I think I prefer to play it with the score. I feel simply more safe. But I think the procedure is, as what we did discuss before, small steps. You secure, let's say, one bar, depending on how long it is, until it is really safe. Then you can add another bar. And after a long time, which is maybe not so long because suddenly it goes fast, then you can master the whole piece. And also, I think it's good if the student can play by heart in front of the teacher, because hopefully the student will be under a positive stress when you have to show it to someone else. But I think the method basically is very simple. First, you intellectualize. Some people have the memory for how it feels in the hands, some for what it sounds like. Some people, if they have photographic memory, which is not really by memory playing then, is that you, so to speak, see in front of you what you're going to play. Or you feel it in the embouchure, you have some physical feedback from the rib cage or whatever. That is my simple answer. But I would say small steps that you put together to longer and longer sequences. Also, that what you can do is to work without the flute. And I remember very well from Paris in the class that Marion said that there was a Japanese student, she was really good, and he said, please tell the others how you practice. And she told us how she practiced, about 3-4 hours a day with the flute, but then she practiced another 2 hours because she practiced 5 hours a day. And we said, asked, what do you do the other 2 hours? I practice without flute, I read scores. So she worked in a way of memorizing the music as a whole with the score. I think one has to be rather pragmatic when it comes to learning. But it is definitely a combination of intellectualization, intuition, and practice. You can't play by heart in front of an audience under pressure if you have not practiced to play under pressure. So the final answer would also be, if you would like to play by heart, if you really like to do it, then practice doing that in little concerts, little situations where you can do it. And I also think it's revealing to think about that if we would have been pianists, it would not have been a big issue at all, because they will play everything by heart. There is also finally a criticism against playing by heart. I guess you all know the name of Gideon Kremer, the outstanding violin virtuoso. He's getting a bit old now, but still. And I remember in the 1980s, that he made protest against all by heart playing and played Brahms' violin concerto, took in a music stand and played from the score, just to make him protest against too much by heart playing. So it's a really complicated issue, but interesting, good that the question came up. Are there more questions or should we proceed?
Yes, there's another question that is related to this theme of intuition. And
yes, please, interesting.
If you could read, Toninho, the question that Mayara Araújo asked.
Sim, posso sim. A Mayara Araújo então pergunta, né? O Anders comentou sobre a questão do lado intuitivo do flautista e do aluno, né? Então ela pergunta, para um aluno que tem pouco desenvolvido este lado intuitivo, como você ou um professor pode abordar ou ajudar a desenvolver uma maior sensibilidade intuitiva? Como a gente pode, como professor, ajudar o aluno a desenvolver a sua intuição musical, com o corpo, no aprendizado com a flauta?
Okay, I will try to answer the question. First of all, I would say that intuition is something that everybody already have. It is not something that we necessarily have to learn, but I can definitely... that we... Yeah, no worry. Also, what I want to say is that intuition is, of course, a part of being a human being. And we use intuition so many times a day, so we can't even count them when we react. And also, to answer the question, I think it might make some sense to think about what is then intuition. I can remember when I started to research the subject of the phenomenon of intuition, that some colleagues told me rather stupidly and said, hang on, Anders, why are you interested in intuition? Intuition is something for women, as I do every day. Intuition. I said, how stupid can you be? I told this person, what is that for ridiculous, stupid ideas, unintelligent. Yes, but you know, you encounter even in research circles strange things. Anyhow, so I did spend quite some time on reading and studying how intuition is described. Of course, intuition is something that has to do with intelligence, and it's not a miracle at all. I would say, to make a very long story very short, that the intuition is something like the conclusion of experiences and decisions made very similarly as when you drive the car. You know what happens when you press the pedals. You know what happens when you deal with the steering wheel. You know all these kind of things. You feel in your body when you accelerate, when you slow down. You don't have to explain that. It's simply there. And when we think about it in these terms, it is, of course, a conclusion of experiences and reactions, lightning fast reactions on things around us. And that can philosophically be proven like that. There is an extremely interesting text on the subject by a Swedish philosopher, Hans Larsson, that was from the beginning of the 20th century, even though from my university, it's the Lundt University. Unfortunately, these texts are not translated into English or any other word language. But that is his conclusion, that it is a kind of an addition of experiences that in a given situation makes a lightning fast reaction. Now is, of course, the question, how can we practice this kind of intuition when performing? There is probably a danger if we want to explain it too much what it might be, but let's see here. I think I can answer your question while going into my manuscript. Because I have some quotes here. I think that could shed some lights on your question. Let's see. We improvise a little bit. First of all, I can take a flutistic example. We can find that on page 40. And that is a quote from Jean-Pierre Rampal, where he says, a natural embouchure means that when you put the flute to your lips, it is automatically in the right position, and you can produce a true sound. Having a natural embouchure is like being able to get on a horse and have your seat in the right place without ever having to think about it. You still have to learn when and how to pull the reins, but you're always perfectly balanced from the beginning. I think we could all replace the horse idea and the embouchure with many other things. That is some kind of instant reaction on what you encounter. We have another quote that goes in this direction. Let's see here. I have to find it here. Yes, I have it here. Intuition is the final stage of processes regarding learning. That is on page 42, top page 42. As the intuition is the final stage of processes regarding learning, the development of thinking and skills, and very much so regarding the arts and artistic creation in the explosive movement of the instance. An example is when Marcel Proust, in À la recherche du temps perdu, and the novel À l'ombre de jeunes filles en fleurs, described how the imaginary painter Elstir, so that's a painter, goes about when painting. When painting, he turns off a discursive stepwise process, as the process that we did discuss before, as different steps in the automatic procedure and in the procedure of practicing. So he discards that when he's going to paint. and the stepwise process is also taken away. Reflection and his experiences' ability to intellectualize in order to instead let an intuitive creation in the instant of the moment take precedence, as that you on purpose, so to speak, take away your facility of being analytical, etc. Then the quote from Proust is, "The effort that Elstir made to discard himself in the presence of reality of all the notions of his intelligence was all the more admirable because this man, who before painting made himself unknowing, forgot everything out of truthfulness, for that what you know you do not own. This man had an exceptionally cultivated intelligence." I think there we have some of the answers that you maybe look for, and that is that we try to discard ourselves from the stepwise thinking, the methodological thought, simply to throw us out in the thing, what we are going to do. Musically speaking, and we are talking about music now, Proust's idea, and Elstir, how he describes the procedure of artistic creation, has affinity with Rameau when he describes in a text from 1754 called Observation sur notre instinct pour la musique, as an observation regarding instinct and music making. And here he is talking about musical performance. The musical performance, I'm absolutely convinced, children, small children, have a sense for beauty. You don't have to have studied in the art academy to have a sense for beauty. Small children have a sense for beauty. Old people have a sense for beauty. I would say even some animals have a sense for beauty, at least more advanced animals. And Rameau, he gives an example. But before I read the quote from Rameau, I would like to comment on that. For me, Jean-Philippe Rameau is something like a 18th century Pierre Boulez. And Pierre Boulez, in a sense, is a 20th century Rameau. Both were incredible composers. Both were incredible performers. Both were great teachers and authors and razor-sharp minds. Both of them. Boulez is very famous for that, but also Rameau, we should remember, he made the foundations for music theory that we still use. In the best moments, Rameau is compared with Mozart as a great, great composer. Okay, what did then Rameau say? Also, in the moment of performing music, and performing music could be a lesson, we play a duet, if we could play Twinkle Twinkle in 2 parts with a child. So Rameau says, on the contrary, we must let ourselves be carried away by the feeling it inspires, the music, without thinking about it, without thinking in a word. And for then, this feeling will become the organ of our judgment. As for reason, it is now in everyone's hands. We have just drawn it from nature's own bosom. We have even proved that instinct reminds us of it all times, and in our actions and in our speeches. That is, of course, in the wording of the French 18th century, instinct in this sense could be replaced by intuition. That's definitely possible. And I think while combining Marcel Proust's ideas regarding this painter, together with Jean-Philippe Rameau, that gives an answer on your question insofar, if you, for example, if you teach, everything from playing Twinkle Twinkle in the most simple little variation, you can find that in the appendixes to the text that you could download. That is, as far as I know, the first example when Twinkle was used in a flute method, and that is by Devienne. It's a very simple little duet. Or it might be ourselves playing what in the symphony orchestra or whatever it might be, to let us be thrown out in the unknown, in a way, in the music. And I remember very well discussing intuition with Alain Marion. He always came back to what Rampal said to him when it came to important moments, an audition, an important concert. He said, you must go for it, take a chance, just throw yourself out in the thing and hope for the best. Now, I will say something that some people might find a little bit too far, but in this L'École de Marseille, that was very much what they did, which sometimes had catastrophic effects. If you trust your intuition in the moment and you take a too big risk, it can be catastrophic. And I think we know about things like that. If I would be personal in this matter, I would say I played very much as a principal flutist soloist with the German chamber orchestra in Köln for 30 years. Now the orchestra does not exist because the manager is retired. Anyhow, and I played very, very often the Telemann double concerto for flute and recorder. And I have a very good friend, she's a recorder virtuoso in Köln. And I remember so well, after a concert, and I think we played that piece hundreds of times, 200-300 times. And she said to me once, Anders, when you walk out from stage, when we have performed our double concerto, you look often very happy. And yes, I said, yes, I think I played well. But we were our good friends. So she said, yes, but allow me to say, sometimes you make little mistakes. I said, yes, I do. Yes, I know. But I think there were really nice moments. So I was still happy. And then she said, okay, and you think that's okay? Yes, absolutely. And then I said to her, we are really good friends. So I said to her, if you allow me to give you a comment on the issue, so I would say, quite often you do look not very happy when you walk out from stage. Yes, she said, that's right. And I said, let me guess, that is because you made a little mistake that I can hear, but nobody in the audience can hear it. But I can hear it because we played it so many times together. And I can hear when you're in super shape. Yes, she said. I said, okay, allow me to make a little joke, but it has a little snatch of being serious. I prefer to play good than correct. But you maybe prefer to play correct and precise instead of playing good. It's a bit stupid, but it's something about it. And I have encountered that several times with that chamber orchestra because we played so many concerts. 150 a year or something like that for a period in the whole world. And then my best friends there, the manager, who was a double bass player, he said, Anders, allow me to say it, the first 5-6 performances of a tour with 30 concerts, you are perfect. But I think you play much better the 7th, the 9th, the 15th performance, because then you relax a little bit, you let go from playing super precise all the time, and you play so much better. And I said, okay, but I make some stupid mistakes sometimes. Yes, but who cares? Who cares? And I remember a recital in Stuttgart that was a very important concert, and I played the C minor concerto by Vivaldi. You know, it's a difficult one, very beautiful. Da 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 di da da di do do do. Virtuosic stuff. And I played the Bach G minor concerto as well. And I made a stupid mistake in the cadenza at the end of the G minor concerto, because I was taken away by my own playing. I thought it went so damn well. And so I made a little stupid mistake. So I came up to him and said, afterwards, I apologize. It was a stupid mistake. He said, that was the best in the whole piece. And that reminds me of something when I made my research interviews with Marion and Peter Lloyd. Because Peter Lloyd, he did never talk about making mistakes. And I think being principal in London Symphony Orchestra, you don't make mistakes simply. It's not good. But Marion talked about that, and that put into the discussion what we have now, taking risks in intuition and all these kind of things. He brought up the subject by himself and said, yes, making mistakes is annoying, of course. But then he gave an example with Zino Francescatti. Maybe you know the name, some of you. That was a great, great violin virtuoso in France, also from Marseille, as a matter of fact. And his heyday was between the big wars and a little bit after the Second World War. And Francis Gatti said, if you play and your intention is expressive, to be expressive, and you happens to slip a little bit with your instrument, then that is the right note. This reminds me about something. I don't think I told you about that. It also has to do with intuition and expression. When I studied in Cologne, the big Academy of Music, I took the elevator, and by coincidence, Mr. Breinin was in the elevator. Did I tell you this story? I don't think so. No. Okay. So we happened to be in the elevator. It's a very big building. And the elevator got stuck. So, you know, it's just stopped between two levels, which was very annoying. Of course, after a quarter of an hour, they found the solutions we could get out. But I had very much respect. I was a very young man, 25 or something like that, for Mr. Breinin. So after a minute or two or three, it was a bit annoying. The silence went on my nerves a little bit. It was a bit strange situation. So I said to Mr. Breinin, could I please ask a question? Yes, of course. They were so friendly, these four men. Of course, you can ask questions as much as you want. So, okay, I would like to ask a question about your recordings of The Death and the Maiden by Schubert. And he started to smile. And then, okay, continue. And yes, I have studied your first recording for the 1950s and your latest, and that was just a couple of years before I met him. And then he really smiled and he said to me, let me guess what you want to ask. Yes, of course. You will ask me why we didn't make a second take in the variation movement, this cello variation, because the cello slips. So it sounds like Schoenberg for 5 seconds. Yes, I said, if you allow me, that is my question. And he said, yes, interesting, of course. The answer deals with what we are talking about now. He said, first of all, we are an old quartet, as you know. We are very well established, so we can allow us that kind of things. We couldn't have done that 40 years ago, but we can do it. It was with Deutsche Grammophon, very prestigious, of course. So he said, but we wanted to set an example that the emotion is more important than perfection, and we can allow ourselves to get bad critics. A young quartet can't. But he said, even more important, it was just a superficial explanation. The deep explanation was, we were not sure that we could achieve the same tension of music and expression. And if we think about that category of musicians, that is hard stuff. They were not sure that they could repeat it. Of course, I could make 50 takes in a row. That is perfect. That would have been perfect. But no, they said, we are not sure. So we kept it. And how long would that have taken to make that take? 1.5 minutes. So it was no stress. Of course, such people, they do what they want in the big studio. If they want to say one more day, they do it. And I think that connects to your question of intuition. It has something to do with emotion. So if we can play emotionally, that will open the door for the student about the emotion. And it doesn't really matter if it's Twinkle or an extremely complicated piece. I don't know if that is so much of an answer, but I prefer to connect to these features, because I think it is of importance. And to end that discussion, I did show the quotes from Rameau and Proust to Alain Marion and to Peter Lloyd. They didn't know them. So they thought it was interesting. And of course, Marion could read it in French, and Peter Lloyd, I did translate it for him. Their reaction was instant. They agreed. They said, absolutely, that's the thing. And Peter Lloyd went so far, so he said, I always say to my students, we prepare technically, but not musically. If it's going to be true, it's got to be spontaneous. I believe that, absolutely. I got to be totally spontaneous whatever happened. I really believe that to be right. If you prepare something so perfectly, you'll never make the performance. In connection to that, I would quote the great French actress Isabelle Huppert. And she once said, when asked about how to prepare for a role and its performance on stage or in a movie, because sometimes Isabelle Huppert have been accused of being too intellectual. And she writes, or she said, you can be intellectual and not thinking when you're acting. You can do your thinking before or after you perform. Intuition comes into play the moment you actually perform. The thinking is done unconsciously. It's never conceptualized or theorized. And if you remember, my model of automatics connects to such a statement. Now, very practically, how we could practice intuition, because intuition can, of course, be, for example, playing in time. If we take an example for more advanced academy students, if we play from Joachim Andersen from the 24 Big Studies, Opus 15, and we take the famous study number 3 in G major, you know, da dee da dee 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 dee, that has this tune. Then I do that so that I play the tune and the student play all the notes. As it was in pre-COVID time, we could do things like that. I play the tune and the student plays, so to speak, second flute with all the notes. Then, to practice the intuitive feel for playing in time, I accelerate, I slow down, completely unforeseeable. And then I ask the student to do the same with me, play the tune and make me follow. And that is a method that could work on all levels, for sure. I hope that is something that could be as an answer for you. Maybe there are questions following up this.
I believe so. Toninho, you're going to read the
Nós
questions?
temos nós temos mais 2 perguntas, mas queria saber do Anders se ele prefere terminar a fala dele, nós colocamos as 2 perguntas ao final, ou se ele responder essas 2 agora.
My answer would be that regarding that, it came up a very interesting question yesterday, dealing with inside mouth cavity, etc. I did add a section to my manuscripts that is in the manuscripts that you can download. So techniques for developing sound colors and resonance. If you want, maybe you can take a look at that, and we could discuss that tomorrow if you prefer that we go over to questions. For me, I'm free. I can do much more, but so it does not coincidence with the rest of your planning for the day, of course. But it's up to you. That maybe could be an idea, because then if you have some minutes left, you can take a look into this with the vowels and how we can work with that. And then we could start tomorrow with a short discussion on the vowels. So we improvise a little bit, and then maybe we go over to more questions, because I guess that is very important. It's up to you.
Então vamos lá com as perguntas, né, Valentina? Tem uma pergunta, Anders, é da Rubenita. Ela pergunta se o senhor já teve a oportunidade de dar aulas, ou conhece, né, quem faz, para pessoas com deficiência, no caso, ensinar flauta para pessoas com deficiência, né? E como seriam essas aulas?
I think to answer the question, it's a complicated question. It depends a little bit what you are aiming for as disabilities. If it has to do with hands or arms or shoulders or embouchure, or could you be a little bit more precise? Because I guess that is very different how to proceed in different situations.
So I think we could go to the other question, then Rubelita could complement her.
Yeah, if she can come back, because
Yes.
it's as an umbrella question is I think it's difficult to answer, because it got to be quite precise.
Good. If Rubelita could go there and complete her question, then we go to the other question now. Isn't okay, Toninho?
Isso, ótimo, Valentina. Esperamos a Rubenita complementar. A próxima pergunta é do Cleison José. O Cleison pergunta: qual a relação entre os movimentos do corpo e os sons tocados na flauta? E ele complementa: movimentos que influenciam os sons e vice-versa.
Yes, also if we think about body movements as a whole, I mean, to joke a little bit about it, without making movements in the body, nothing happens. But I guess that you aim for these kind of movements when you perform. And I think that is a question of age of the musicians, and I would say an exaggerated movement would harm the flute playing. Now, it does definitely depend on which kind of music you play. When I have seen flutists, which I think is a great flutist, that's the old generation, but this is Ian Anderson in that old rock group, Jethro Tull. He moves in a way that is not necessarily the best, I guess, when you play a Mozart concerto, but it works very well in his style. Let me give you a comment on that with age. And Valentina or Tonino, please tell me if I told this story before, but I don't think I did so. It was with the students this week. Quite some years ago, we had a guest teacher at our Academy of Music here, Tatiana Nikolaeva. There was a monument of a piano professor from the old Soviet Union, as Russia. She was the main professor in Moscow at the Tchaikovsky Conservatoire. And she looked like Lily Laskin, a very short old lady, the harpist, the French harpist. And anyhow, Tatiana Nikolaeva, she came here and she gave master classes, and I went there. It was, of course, very interesting to listen to her teaching. At that moment, we had a very talented piano student, and he was about 18 years old, 18, 19, maximum 19. And later on, he made a career. I think he lives in New York now and makes a freelance career as a classical pianist in New York. And that is not to joke around with. There are many that want to do that. He's very good. Anyhow, he played some music by Rachmaninoff, if I remember. And he was a young man, and his body movement was very similar to Lang Lang, although Lang Lang had not made a career in that, but it was wild what he did with his body. So what happened is that one of my colleagues, one staff member here, he's a pianist, and he works with the accompaniment of the clarinet class, and he had studied in Russia. So he speaks Russian, and he's married with a Russian woman. So after that, this super talented young guy, 18, 19 years old, had played his Rachmaninoff. He went up and started to talk with Tatiana Nikolaeva in Russian. So we couldn't understand anything. And I think that was on purpose. He spoke in Russian. She couldn't speak English. She spoke German when she spoke with us. That was in German language. Anyhow, we could see that the old fabulous piano professor, Tatiana Nikolaeva, got irritated on the discussion my colleague had with her. So after that, the discussion had been going on for about 5 minutes. She said, stop, and said, now I have to tell the audience what you said and what I answered you. And she said, your colleague came up to me to tell me that I should tell the young boy, the very talented young pianist, that he should stop move so much. But I told your colleague, that kind of rubbish I don't like, because I'm a very experienced professor. She said, I know that young men in his age, they do things like that when they are 18, 19 years old. When he will be 35, he has found out by himself not to do that. So it is a terrible advice to give him not to move while playing. It's simply not intelligent. I think that is an interesting comment. I can give you a comment very similar to that. And that is shakuhachi, you know, the Japanese instrument. And I have had some contact with people in Japan doing that, but I don't try to play it myself, of course. But there is, in the old style, traditional style of teaching, then the teacher kneels down and sits on the floor, and the student makes the same. Teacher takes up his shakuhachi and starts to play. There are no explications. The student should imitate. Then, as on all instruments, you can have a more idiomatic or less idiomatic positioning of your hands, fingers, whatever. When there is a strange way of holding or maneuvering your fingers, then the experienced shakuhachi master knows this is completely normal. 3-4 years, it looks like that. It makes no sense to talk about that. So he doesn't comment. And then the student hopefully make progress. If the student then after 6-7 years still have a bit strange positioning on the hands, then the sensei, the real teacher, thinks, okay, apparently that works as well, so I don't say anything. And I think that mirrors a bit of what you were asking about movements with the body. I think there are two aspects of it, or maybe more. One is age. I moved much more when I was much younger, when I played. And I move a little bit less now because I think my technique is better now. So I don't need that. But from the musical expression, so the technical part of moving or not moving is obvious. If the movements are too big, and at least when you got to be very precise with embouchure and all that kind of stuff, then of course a well-centered body is the solution. And also if you look at it historically, in the 18th century, we have many treatises on the violin, the harpsichord, the traverso, and so forth. All the time the recommendation is not to move too much. Because if you try the traverso, everything is so small, you got to be so precise. So if you move too much, it will be not so easy to play. That is the technical part of it. But then there is also the musical part. And I would say, as with so many other things, if your music comes out better by moving more, why not? It depends, but we have to fulfill criteria of good sound, good intonation, good articulation, and things like that. Definitely body movements can help musical expression to quite some extent. I'm convinced about that. But if you think about not necessarily flute players as musicians, but conductors, then if you speak with older orchestra musicians and very, very experienced, many of us then like conductors that don't move too much. At the same time, we can say, but how about Leonard Bernstein? Yes, wasn't he great? Yes, he was great. Incredible. But he could manage and put it together. If you maybe have seen movies or there are recordings with Richard Strauss made long time ago when he's conducting Elektra, when the orchestra is boiling of energy, and Richard Strauss is doing simply like that. Small movements. But still is an incredibly expressive music. So I think one has to be taking in account the age of the player, the technical dimension of it. Does it harm the playing? Sometimes it doesn't matter if it harms the playing, if the musical expression comes out better. And for sure, in certain situations, a movement can definitely contribute to expression. But personally, I would always prefer to center my body as much as possible and never do more than necessary. That is a classical law. That is the same when we look at the Japanese swordsmanship. We say never do more than necessary. And that is a classical law also in theater. If you need to make this gesture, you make this gesture, but you don't make this gesture because that might blur the intensity of what you want to express. I hope that is partly, at least, an answer of your question.
Yes, thank you, Anders. We're checking here because I don't believe we have a long time for you to start the next topic, about the vowels
I
and
think we do it tomorrow.
colors.
We make a short session on that tomorrow.
Yes,
So
okay.
if there are more questions, maybe we can manage 1 or 2 or 3 questions. We can do that.
Okay.
I think the interaction with you is very important.
Okay, Toninho, do you have other questions there?
Não, eu acho que nós fechamos as perguntas que foram colocadas no chat.
Wonderful.
Sim.
I believe Rubenita didn't compliment her question about.
But maybe we can carry on the question, because it's a very interesting one that I can also say what this. Something like that, having maybe difficulty with movements, physical movements, is a subject very much discussed at here in the Nordic countries at the moment. How we can take into account students with that kind of disability. Maybe you have seen, just a short comment on the subject. There is a horn player. I think he's from Austria. He's an incredible horn player, but due to some kind of disease, I don't know what it was, he can't move his hands. So but he can move his toes on the fingers. So he sits in a kind of special made chair, and he plays the horn beautifully. I've seen a broadcast about him and his horn playing as a fantastic virtuoso on the French horn. But he has to maneuver the ventils with his toes. So they made a very special kind of chair for that. And that, of course, normally people would say that's impossible. You can't play the French horn. Maybe you can sing. Maybe that is a possibility for you, but you can't play an instrument that needs these kind of motorical movements. But it happened. And I have pictures in one of my books that flute players that was injured in wars and things like that could have a special stand, because they couldn't hold up the arm, so they had a special stand to put the flute on, because they wanted to carry on playing the flute. There is another example, and I'm so angry on myself that I can't remember, but I didn't ask the name, and I guess several of you might have heard it, and if you have heard the same story and know the name, please let me know. That I'd loved to give that, to tell in France, the environment around Rampal and these people, that there was a great flute player that was a part of the French army in the First World War. And he came back with only one lung. But what could he do? He was a good flute player, wanted to continue. So he had to carry on his life as a professional flutist with one lung. And that is really something. And they said he was breathing all the time, but nobody thought about that, and he was not using circular breathing, of course not. But he knew the clever places where to breathe. And as Rampal always said, breathe often. It's always better to take a breath more than a breath less. And that also gives an idea and a comment on disabilities, some physical problem in your playing. But obviously, to play a musical instrument is very much, you need fine motorical movements. But it depends a little bit on the instrument, of course. And yeah. But I hope we can return to the question tomorrow.
Yes, and there is another question here.
Yes.
Do Rogério Ascioli, isn't it, Toninho?
Isso. Tem uma pergunta, dois Rogérios, o Rogério Ascioli e o Rogério Perucci. O Rogério Ascioli faz uma pergunta que o Anders falou um pouco sobre ela ontem, inclusive, mas ele pergunta, ele afirma, nosso melhor som é uma média do todo, das 3 oitavas em conjunto, e não o que conseguimos para cada oitava isoladamente. O que ele acha sobre isso?
I think it depends on what we are going to play, but I think as a point of departure, a model if we talk a little about the French flute tradition, has been to find an evenness of the 3 octaves, and also to find, we could say, a blend between the 3 octaves. And in the best of words, we should be able to do more or less the same in all 3 octaves, but within limits, of course. Then, if we play if we push the standards very far, and that we can abuse an evenness of sound, that it sounds very similar in all 3 octaves, I think that could be an abuse, but it is, as a method, and then I relate to the tradition, it is a hallmark, we all know, that try to be able to do the same thing in all 3 octaves, but the 3 octaves have their own character. And a way to describe this character, and I think that is a very important spin-off to your question, is that if we listen to flute players, and we say we listen to really good flute players, sometimes it is easier to hear the distinct personal sound of the player in the first octave compared with the high octave. As a simply, the personalization possibility is for sure somewhat more developed in the lower register, because in the lower register, let's say the first 1.5 octaves, something like that, we can influence the spectrum of overtones in a little bit different way, because when we come up in the super high register, high D, and so then the spectrum of overtones are so high up in frequencies, so they are more difficult to hear. So I would say it's a good idea to try to work on evenness of sound over all 3 octaves, including the very top. But then this will be very monotonous if we play like that all the time. So we need to be able to make variations. And of course, that includes embouchure, different directions of the air. We all know that, of course, you know all these things. But I think as a point of departure, being able to give the notes, which has a little bit a lack of color, if I may say so, that we need to give them more color. The notes with having too much color, if I call it like that, we should practice to take away a little bit of the color, but keep the potential possibility of color. And then there are some notes which has a kind of a in between these two things. But it's of course very important to develop the characteristics of the different register. And I think that also connects to the idea of how we work with the cavity of the mouth, of the throat, with the focal points of resonance. And there are very many possibilities, although sometimes thinking about it, the possibilities are bigger than in reality. There are some research on these kind of things. How much does actually the cavity of the mouth influence the sound color? And it's no question it does influence, but of course less than for a singer. I don't know if that is an answer. If you want to continue your question, because it's highly interesting.
I think tomorrow we will do that, isn't it? We are going to discuss about also about the vowels and stuff. So
yeah, it connects to the question, definitely.
Yes, yes. So thank you for today. I think we learned a lot.
Thank you.
And I think Tunir has some. Yeah, because we have lots of comments about Holland and about the philosophers and all there. But I think we could stop here. Anthony, yes. Antonio has something to say about the events that are coming today.
Sim, primeiro agradeço ao Anders, maravilhoso, Anders, muito obrigado por tudo. E agradecemos todos a
It's a pleasure. May I just ask you? Then I leave the Zoom now, and we connect tomorrow. Same hour, same place. 6:30 Central European Time, 1:30 Brazilian time.
Sim, Anders.
And you send me, if necessary, you send me the Zoom address.
Exatamente.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Ok, Anders. E nós agradecemos também a todos que estiveram junto conosco neste momento. Nós estamos felicíssimos com a participação de tantas pessoas online com a gente, no YouTube, né? E depois assistindo os vídeos também. Isso tem sido uma resposta incrível e com perguntas tão boas também. As perguntas que não foram respondidas hoje serão respondidas amanhã, não é isso mesmo? E eu só queria dizer a programação de hoje à noite, né? Hoje é sábado, às 17 horas. Hoje nós teremos improvisação de choro com o Serginho Moraes, né? E às 19 horas, na série das apresentações musicais, nós teremos o Concerto dos Vencedores do concurso Abraf de 2020, com a Letícia Maia, participação especial de Jonadab Batista e Sérica Saito no piano. Então, muito obrigado, boa noite a todos e amanhã nos encontramos no mesmo horário.